It started with a warehouse fire, an explosion actually. October 16, 2014, Verbitice, Czech Republic, now referred to as Czechia. A massive explosion rips through a remote munition depot in the Moravian countryside, killing 2 workers and sending shockwaves far beyond the Czech border. The blast destroys 58 tons of ammunition. At the time, it was treated as a tragic accident, a terrible misfire, nothing more. But years later, our team uncovered the surprising truth. This was no accident. It was a targeted act of sabotage by Russia's secretive Black Ops unit, Unit 29155. And Verbitice wasn't the first of these attacks. For years, Unit 29155 ran a coordinated campaign to blow up arms depots across NATO countries in Eastern Europe, depleting supplies of munitions likely bound for Russia's enemies, including Ukraine. Hi, I'm Christo Grozev, an investigative journalist specializing in exposing corruption, criminality, and frequently, Russian intelligence operations. This is the story of how we discovered that Unit 29155, the same Russian unit behind the 2018 poisoning in Salisbury and the 2015 poisoning of Emilian Gebrev in Bulgaria, was also behind a string of deadly arms depot explosions across Europe. If you're joining us for the first time, this is episode 4 of our ongoing investigative series on Unit 29155. If you haven't seen these prior episodes, I'd recommend you start there. Because for me, these investigations each helped us to unspool the truth, one puzzle piece at a time. If you remember our first episode, we identified 2 unit operatives by the names of Alexander Mishkin and Colonel Anatoly Chepiga, who were responsible for poisoning Sergei and Yulia Skripal in Salisbury. They were supervised at the time from London by a third spy, Denis Sergeyev. We knew that they were all active agents of Unit 29155, but we wanted to know what other acts they may have been part of. Armed with knowledge of their true identities, along with the aliases that they used in the Salisbury poisonings, Alexander Petrov, Ruslan Boshirov, and Sergei Fedotov, we began digging into their travel data, their travel history, to see where else they had traveled over the years, what other events they could have been connected to. There was one event that quickly stood out for us. An explosion in Czechia in 2014 at a warehouse full of munitions. In the press and by the Czech police, that explosion had been written off as a mistake, an industrial accident, a fire that started it all and set the entire place ablaze. By now we knew something they didn't. Mishkin and Chepiga had been in town at the same time. Travel data showed us that the 2 had flown into Prague on October the 11th and left the morning of October 16th, the same day that the warehouse explosion took place in Verbitice. They had used the same fake identities that they had used to travel to the UK for the Salisbury poisoning 3 years later, Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Boshirov, supposedly traveling sports nutritionists. On social media, we observed that they were posing as tourists, with Boshirov posting a photo on Facebook of Prague's old town. So these 2 Unit 29155 operatives, who we had already known as trained killers, were also in Czechia at the time of the explosion. When I was investigating this story in 2020, I was working at Bellingcat. Our team decided to publish these findings fresh, announcing that we had found Chepiga and Mishkin present in Czechia during the period when large arms depots exploded in northern Moravia. We were suspicious, rightfully so, but we didn't know the whole truth, and we were curious if others would find out more information and contribute to our investigation. In April 2021, Czech authorities announced their own findings. They had found that Unit 29155 was behind the explosions of the Verbitice ammunition depots in 2014. Following Bellingcat's revelations, they had reopened the investigation and they had discovered old, forgotten evidence directly connecting Alexander Petrov and Ruslan Boshirov to the exploded depots. Email correspondence with a company leasing the warehouses showed that Mishkin and Chepiga had requested access to the ammunition storage facilities at the exact same window of time that the explosions took place. They were posing this time not as sports nutritionists but as arms buyers from a company supposedly interested in purchasing munition from the Czech Republic. Their request listed the dates October 13 to the 17th, 2014 as their desired window to visit the warehouses, a time frame that ended just 1 day after the explosions. Remarkably, the request was approved by Nikolai Shaposhnikov, a naturalized Czech citizen with a past in the Soviet army who worked as a consultant at the Emacs Group, the company that leased the warehouses. Sabotage mysteriously died of a heart attack just days before a crucial questioning by the Czech police. His wife, Elena Sabotage, traveled at least once to Russia with a secretly owned service passport from the same range used by other members of Unit 29155. She also repeatedly communicated by email with Andrei Averyanov, the commander of Unit 29155, and she and her husband spent a vacation with Averyanov in Portugal just a week before the explosions in Verbatice. She said it was a friendly vacation, not a preparatory meeting for the terrorist attack in the center of Europe that would kill 2 innocent people just a few days later. But we'll get to that. According to Czech investigators, Mishkin and Chepiga were granted access to the depot using new false identities. One of them, Chepiga, used the identity of a Tajik person, and the other one, Mishkin, used the stolen identity of a Moldovan citizen. You see, the visitors to the storage could not be Russian, so they couldn't be Petrov and Bashir for that particular operation. That might have raised too many red flags. Whether they physically entered the munition warehouse remains unconfirmed until today. However, as representatives of Emacs say, they never showed up. However, Czech investigators did uncover that the son of the Sabotage family drove into the warehouse just before the explosions, using his special status to avoid inspection of his car. Whether Mishkin and Chepiga were in the trunk of his car, we'll never know, but somebody was. What's even more telling of Mishkin and Chepiga's involvement with the explosions is the precise timing of their departures from Central Europe back to Moscow. The explosions occurred on the morning of October 16 at 9:25 a.m. The blast was so intense that an hour later, the Institute of Geophysics at the Czech Academy of Science registered a large earthquake. Within the hour, Mishkin and Chepiga took off from nearby Vienna back to Moscow. This led us to assume that during their visit to the site, they must have set up some kind of a remote detonator. At the same time that the Czechs published their new findings about Mishkin and Chepiga's visit to Emacs warehouses, our team at Bellingcat was also publishing a separate set of new revelations, which expanded our understanding of the unit's involvement far beyond just Mishkin and Chepiga. We looked at travel data from the days and the cities around the Czech munition explosions, and we found 4 other Unit 29155 members that had traveled under fake identities to the region in exactly the same time window of the attacks, including the unit's commander, Andrei Averyanov. Using his passport under the fake name of Averyanov, he had booked an Aeroflot flight to Vienna, arriving on the 13th of October 2014. The return flight was 2 days later, on the 15th of October. There were 3 other members who purchased plane tickets on the same morning as Averyanov to travel into the region for the same window of time. Lieutenant Colonel Nikolai Izhov bought a ticket to Vienna on the 11th of October 2014, returning on the 15th of October. He was booked under his alias as Nikolai Kononikhin. Alexei Kapinos and Evgeny Kalinin, 2 other unit members, also booked tickets that same morning, but they booked them under their real names rather than using aliases. They were scheduled to travel to Budapest under diplomatic cover, carrying diplomatic mail pouches, arriving on October the 10th and leaving on the 15th. Now, traveling with diplomatic mail pouches and being connected to Unit 29155 is always a bit suspicious, because it allows you to carry items into a foreign country without any search of those items. They were frequently used to transport sensitive intelligence, or in this case, maybe sensitive devices. Our working theory at Bellingcat at the time was once all of the unit members arrived in the region separately, they each drove to convene in Ostrava, a town about an hour away from the munition depots where Bushirov and Petrov were checked into a hotel. There, they must have prepared to plant the remote-controlled explosives at the Verbatice depot. By the time the devices were successfully detonated days later, all of the agents were already on their way home, save one who stuck around in Vienna for a few more days. This was a pattern that would repeat itself in other Unit 29155 operations. Agents arrived days before an attack, convene from separate entry points into Europe, gain access to the target site, and then disappear immediately from different locations, but right after the incident. Whether they personally planted the device, or coordinated with others to do it, or just needed to get close enough to hit the detonator, the implication was clear. They were there, they had requested direct access, and the depot exploded right after that. At the time, This was the earliest known example of the GRU using direct on-site access under commercial cover to enable sabotage on NATO-aligned soil. It was a big deal and a big investigation for us. But it was also important because this was one of the only known times that the unit's commander, General Averianov, had traveled himself to the site of an operation. It suggested that this was an important one. But we still had one major question: why? To answer that, we had to look at the target of the explosions. The warehouses full of munitions were leased and operated by Imex Group, a Czech arms trader. But more importantly, some of the material in that depot was earmarked for export through Bulgaria to Emilian Gebrev. He had a Bulgarian company called EMCO, which exported arms to different countries around the world. You'll remember Emilian Gebrev from episode 2 of this series. Unit 29155 attempted to poison him in Bulgaria just a year after the Verbatice explosions. Gebrev's company EMCO wasn't just an arms dealer and arms exporter. It was one of the only independent weapons exporters in Eastern Europe that had managed to stay out of Russian influence. EMCO specialized in refurbishing and producing Soviet-compatible munitions, exactly the kind of weaponry needed by Ukraine, Georgia, and Syrian rebel forces fighting Russian-backed regimes. This made EMCO and Gebrev a high-value target for Moscow. They were supplying the enemy, and now they had a target on their back. In the case of the warehouse, what I later learned was that at least some of the destroyed munitions at Verbatice was slated or believed to be slated for export to Ukraine. The motive became clear. This wasn't just general sabotage. It was a Kremlin-directed strategy to disrupt weapons flows to Russian adversaries. And very recently, in one of our subsequent investigations at The Insider, we discovered an actual almost confession by a member of Unit 29155. In a direct message on Twitter, a member of the unit tells the person that he is trying to recruit, "Our goal is to control the flow of weapons from Bulgaria." It seemed that independent arms entrepreneurs like Emilian Gebrev were out of their control and they needed to be stopped or silenced. And to achieve that, the Russian GRU were willing to blow up everything that stood in their way. After uncovering the GRU's overlap with the explosions in Verbatice, we applied the same method of investigations elsewhere. We started by scanning for other unexplained munition explosions in regions where we suspected Russia might want to disrupt weapons flows. And soon, at least one such case surfaced, an explosion reported in the Bulgarian press on November 2011. You see, the facility at Lovindol had been rented by EMCO, the Bulgarian arms trading company, but it had just received a large weapons shipment from the Czech Republic from the trading company Imex, the same group that was operating the depots in Verbatice. At the time of the explosions, it was storing Soviet-era munitions on behalf of clients such as Gebrev's EMCO. According to EMCO's shipping reports, a significant quantity of highly valued artillery rounds, particularly of the Soviet-compatible 152mm variant, were in the warehouses at the time of the explosion, all earmarked for exports to Georgia. This was just 3 years after Russia's invasion of Georgia, and tensions were still high in the region. This was all enough to be suspicious. Another depot explosion full of munitions potentially bound for an adversary of Russia. But it was actually a Bulgarian police investigative report that I accessed about the explosions that really caught my attention. It included one particular detail that shocked me. During the cleanup, investigators had found a partially intact device that hadn't detonated. According to the report, it was an IED, an improvised explosive device concealed in a seemingly ordinary container, wrapped in polyethylene, with wires sticking out, a timing mechanism, and a low-powered battery setup. The forensic team concluded that it failed to detonate due to insufficient current. But finding it was a key piece of evidence that this had been a bombing, not just a fire or an incident. The device wasn't sophisticated, but it had clearly been built for concealment, and with the intent to delay the explosion until way after it's been planted. At the time, it seemed like a bizarre and isolated finding, but with what we now know about GRU's methods, especially their emphasis on remote time sabotage, this overlooked little detail became a vital clue. It suggested a level of strategic planning and covert insertion that matched everything we were seeing in Unit 29155 operations that we were tracking at the time. So we looked again at travel records and cross-border activity around the 2011 explosion in Bulgaria. We couldn't find actual proof of Unit 29155 agents in the area at the time, but we started to see a lot of travel in and out of Czechia in the same time window, particularly near Verbitice, and that's when something clicked. Maybe, just maybe, the device had been planted among the munitions before they were ever transferred to the warehouses in Bulgaria. The unit's practice of using remote and delayed detonators validated this potential theory. But we needed more. A shipping report from EMCO from that year later showed that in the 1-month period before the explosion, more than 6,000 artillery rounds were shipped from Czechia to Bulgaria. Again, these would have been the variants earmarked potentially for Georgia, or at least the Russians would have believed so. This opened up a possibility for the reality that the detonators had been attached in Czechia, not in Bulgaria, and that their explosions were delayed until they were in position in Bulgaria. So we started to look for any travel patterns not towards Bulgaria, but to Verbitice again, instead of Bulgaria. The first agents we recognized flew into Bratislava airport in Slovakia on October the 10th, just a 90-minute drive away from the Verbitice depot. The ticket included Nikolai Kononichin, the agent actually named Nikolai Yezhov that we talked about earlier. We had previously identified him as present during the 2014 bombing in Verbitice. Also a new member, Sergei Ryzhikov, whose real identity, we now know, is that of Lieutenant Colonel Sergei Romanov. Both men remained in Slovakia until October the 20th, giving them 10 days to travel in and out of Czechia by car. Next to those arrivals was Commander Averyanov, who flew into Vienna on October 12th that year. Metadata from his phone showed that he crossed into Czechia the next day, likely going to meet with a team in Verbitice. He left again on October 18th from Vienna. Then he was followed by Colonel Alexei Kapinos, a name that is also familiar. He arrived on October 21st, flew into Bratislava under his real name as a diplomat, and he flew back to Moscow again on the 28th. Last but not least, we found two others entering the area on October 22nd. Rustam Jamalov, a senior GRU officer named Lieutenant Colonel Rustam Jafarov, and Ruslan Bushirov, whose real name, of course, you know, is Colonel Anatoly Chepiga. The two left on the 25th, which also happens to be the day on which the ammunition was shipped out of Czechia and into Bulgaria. Once again, we found this convergence of Unit Tulan Wi-Fi 5 agents around the munitions just weeks before the explosions. That was pretty convincing, and it showed that Unit Tulan Wi-Fi 5 was behind the Lovindol explosions as well. But we still wondered how they would have detonated it. Was it a time device? Were they manual detonators that somebody had to press a button on? Did they have to be in range? How was the unit working to mitigate risk for themselves, if at all? In 2020, as we were investigating the truth about Lovindol, we discovered an incredible piece of new evidence. We had exclusively obtained access to Averyanov's emails and to Unit Tulan Wi-Fi 5 burner accounts containing memos prepared for Averyanov by his GRU saboteurs. And this particular memo, it was like something out of a spy novel. It described a full-blown sabotage device design competition held in the city of Krasnodar just 6 months before the explosions at Lovindol. The memo outlined how GRU operatives were tasked with inventing new methods of destruction, bombs that could be hidden in plain sight, disguised so that they could cross borders under the guise of everyday household items. Attached were photos, a Wi-Fi router, an Apple juice box, a mobile phone. Each device had been rigged with remote-controlled detonators and timed arming mechanisms. These were improvised explosive devices with delayed detonators. They could be set up within warehouses or munition shipment facilities and detonated immediately, or their activation could be delayed until the munition had been moved from one location to another and the people had gone back home to Russia and were out of danger. It was brilliant and could potentially explain several other depot explosions over the years, even those that we couldn't directly connect to Unit Tulan Wi-Fi 5 members at the time of the attack. In all of these cases, GRU's goal was consistent: destroy Soviet-compatible arms that could aid Russia's enemies and eliminate these facilitating the shipments. But that wasn't all. They were also interested in covering up the truth. On May 31, 2015, an unexplained fire consumed a police forensic center in Sofia, the same one that housed all of the evidence from the Iganovo explosion just a few weeks prior. Travel data revealed that Egor Gordienko, yet another member of Unit Tulan Wi-Fi 5, had arrived in Sofia 2 days before the fire. His phone data shows that he drove to Belgrade just hours before the fire started. Hard to believe that that's a coincidence. What was very clear was that this series of explosions wasn't a series of accidents. It was a Kremlin-directed campaign of terror. A covert war, waged not only through sabotage and poison, but through the systematic dismantling of NATO-aligned arms flows to Ukraine and beyond. So if you've made it this far in the series, thank you. But again, this isn't the end. In the next episodes, we'll explore everything from a duo of Russian illegals who helped coordinate operations of Unit around Wi-Fi 5 to the group's attempted coup in Montenegro, influenced campaigns in Moldova, and political operations that reached as far as Barcelona. This next chapter isn't about weapons, it's about power and influence.